There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. Matthieu Heimel grew up not knowing anything about his biological parents. His life in Perth had been enough for him until his two children began asking questions about where he came from that he found himself unable to answer. So, in late 2018, Matthew embarked on a DNA search for his mother and his father. He found his dad, Jerry, relatively easily, a US serviceman who had been stationed in the Philippines in 1978 when Matthew had been conceived. Finding his mother, however, proved far more difficult.
Last year, my two boys started to ask me questions about my origins and where they are coming from. I thought that it was time for me to learn more about my story.
Using social media, he connected with members of his mother's family. He was told that Nenita, the woman who had given birth to him 42 years ago, was missing. As he asked more questions, he learned that she'd moved to Melbourne in 1985, and then, a few years later, she'd vanished. The closer he looked, the clearer it became that Nenita had likely been murdered. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Simon Illingworth. Simon is an Australian former police officer who, for much of his career, was a member of the Homicide Squad and Anti-Corruption Unit. Simon investigated and prosecuted murderers and later helped weed out and prosecute corrupt police officers. Simon was also involved in Matthieu Heimel's investigation into his mother's disappearance and appeared alongside him in the docu-series Every Family Has a Secret on SBS. Let's start with Matthew, who was born in the Philippines and he was adopted at a very young age. He tried to find his mother through some Facebook groups and ended up connecting with an uncle and an auntie. What did they say had happened to his mum?
Yeah, so he was reaching out to try and find his mother, his biological mother, and he did find some relatives that explained to him that she was missing. They also explained that they'd been notified at one stage that there was a body found on the beach in Melbourne, and they were asked if they would send someone over to Melbourne. But I think, their poverty that they live in made that impossible, and so no one went, and that was really the last of it. But that didn't stop Matthew. He was on a bit of a mission, and as it turned out, he ended up in Australia, which is where his mother, Nenita, went missing in Melbourne.
On the 8th of January, 1987, she vanished, and her body has never been found. This is something I didn't expect to find, that my mum maybe has been a victim of a murder, etc. So it was quite intense.
So she moved to Melbourne in 1985. Where did she start working when she arrived?
So she got a job as a housekeeper with a number of other women. There were Filipino women there, mostly new immigrants. The Melbourne Club, just to explain, is probably the most exclusive club in Melbourne, still is, has been for a long, long time. So the sort of members that you would have there would be people high up in the judiciary, in politics, both as politicians and also background people and so on. So it's really the movers and shakers that are members there, and that's where she worked as a housekeeper.
And what do we know about her husband, Greg Evans, who she was sort of with when she moved to Australia?
They met overseas and came back and married. I don't know a lot. There's not a huge amount that I know about Greg, other than the fact is that when she went missing, he was the initial suspect, which turns out to be a fairly sad thing to be accused of. And I understand that he's unwell.
In 1987, she vanished. So that's a few years after she arrived in Melbourne.
Yes.
What happened when her husband reported her missing? What were sort of the first steps for police? As you say, he became a suspect pretty quickly, but did they have any other leads?
Well, look, not a lot is known other than the fact that Matthew's mother, Annie, or Nenita is her true name, she was working at the Melbourne Club. She was working with a person by the name of Vince Leonardi. When she went missing, there had been rumours of an affair between Nenita and Vincenzo Leonardi. And so the police, probably quite rightly, made Greg the initial suspect because, of course, there's a motive there because it's alleged that his wife was having an affair.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vince, I suppose, wasn't so much in the picture yet. But Nenita wasn't the first woman to go missing from the Melbourne Club, was she? Or she wasn't the only woman?
No, there was another lady, another Filipino, Milagros Dark. She went missing in 1990. Her body was found bashed. She'd been murdered. She too also worked for Vince. So Vince was working in the Melbourne Club and was really in control of the housekeepers there, which is a fairly discreet role, I would imagine. So there was also an allegation that there was an affair between Vince and Milagros prior to her death. So she was found, as I say, bashed and murdered in a park. And of course, the prime suspect was her husband. Unfortunately, much the same as Greg, a spotlight was put on him. And indeed, he was charged quite quickly. Just as quickly, the charges were withdrawn through lack of evidence.
There was a coronial inquest in 1995 over Nenita's death. What did they find?
Just to explain, so Vince was at that coronial inquest and refused to give evidence at that coronial hearing on the grounds of self-incrimination, which is an interesting sort of scenario when, at its best, he would be a workmate of both of them. So whilst everyone has that right, it does sort of prick the ears a bit.
Yeah, and as you say, it did seem that there was something going on between him and Nenita. There were rumours.
Yes.
How convincing is that theory? Is there any evidence? Has her husband suggested that there was something going on?
There's nothing that you can sort of put your finger on. He was known to drive the staff home, despite him living in the opposite direction to both Nenita and Milagros. So that in itself sort of, I suppose, starts to indicate that there was more to it. But realistically, the fact that there was or wasn't an affair is certainly something that the police tried to work out, particularly when they were looking at the two husbands as suspects.
Yeah, and you go into some background about his life. You sort of do some research there, and you find that he had an interesting relationship with a woman named Anna Maria Pontarolo. What was that relationship?
This is interesting, and this is where Matthew's search for his biological mother really goes down the track of following Vince's life as opposed to his mother's life to give him answers as to what happened to her. And so Anna Maria Pontarolo, she was on the same boat to Australia that Vince Leonardi was on, and that left in 1950. They then struck up a relationship. She became pregnant at that time. Vince was travelling over to Australia to actually, I suppose, set down roots so he could bring his wife, Flora, over to Australia once he'd sorted himself out, I assume getting a job and somewhere to live, which is not unusual. He met Anna Maria, she became pregnant to Vince, and then she started living with Vince and had 2 children to Vince. And then they were waiting on Flora, his wife, to come. And so what happened was that Flora arrived and they lived under the same roof, I believe in Brighton. The interesting thing is that as far as Anna Maria goes, so she had 2 young children, she's living under the same roof of Vince and his wife Flora, and then she goes missing. There's no missing persons report. She literally vanishes off the face of the earth.
There's an interesting detail that you have about how Vince had her 2 children begin calling Flora their mother.
So that in itself is a real trigger for me, being a former homicide investigator, that you could only assume, other than foul play, that Anna Maria has left. You would then ask yourself, well, why does Vince then tell the children that their mother is Flora? And indeed, why would Flora pretend to be the mother? And so those children had lived that lie for many years. And again, I mean, the problem is that you've got someone who's a new immigrant who comes here, who, Anna Maria, there's no one here for her. There's no one other than Vince can report her missing. And so, it begs the question, why didn't he report her missing? She's never been seen again. There's nothing, no bank accounts, none of the usual things that you would look for that she comes up on from that time that she left.
What did her family do? Did they report her missing? Was there an adequate investigation following her disappearance?
I mean, we're obviously talking a long time ago, but Anna Maria's family, the Pontarollos, sent a relative over to Australia to try and ascertain her whereabouts. So it goes without saying, you would be beside yourself that, someone in your family's gone missing. So she's come over. She's come to the family house, and Vince has told her that she must pretend that Flora is the children's mother. So I have no doubt that would have triggered something, and so that there was not to be any conversation about Anna Maria at all in front of the children. And so the lie, I suppose, continued.
Is there any suggestion that Vince was a violent man?
Oh, without a doubt, Vince was a violent man. And that also that's something that there's allegations that the two young girls were having an argument at home and he threw an axe at them. Horrible stuff. There was also, one of them was seriously assaulted and spent 3 weeks bedridden, and she'd been threatened that he'd kill her. You start adding a few of these things up and it's more than worthy of an investigation, and unfortunately Vince is dead. So that obviously limits any chances there are of a prosecution or an interview or anything. So giving, even to be fair, to giving him an opportunity to explain what's happened. But ultimately, well, you've got Matthew wanting to know what's happened. You've got relatives all over the world that are wanting to know what's happened. One of the interesting things was a comment by Vince at the Melbourne club to some of the housekeepers. He was looking at a block of land and said it was big enough that you could bury bodies in it. I mean, quite an odd comment by any stretch. But realistically, that then triggers me to say, well, all is not lost here as far as this investigation goes, because, there may well be bodies buried. That's something that the police perhaps should look at, and it's not unusual to, try and find bodies, even though you've got no chance of prosecution. If anything, it gives a lot of these people, some peace. Yeah,
the point about a body is interesting, because you said earlier that there was a body that was found in Melbourne on a beach, and her family couldn't come and identify that body because they didn't even have a passport.
Yeah.
But there was a DNA test done to see if Matthew perhaps, was linked to anyone who had been found and hadn't been identified. Were any of those tests, did they find a match?
No, they didn't. And so, the unfortunate reality is that the body that they were talking about was not Nenita. And having spoken to Matthew, like any other victim's family, they always hold out hope that they're still alive and living under a fictitious name or whatever. And part of me as a homicide investigator says, well, the likelihood of that is highly remote, and that's the unfortunate reality. But ultimately, they want to know. And I think that the potential is that the police can actually try and find the bodies.
Of course, and the coronial inquest did find that she was most likely deceased, and so it seems that's the probability. In 1987, when she actually wasn't working, Nenita wasn't working at the Melbourne club anymore, but she went back to visit, and that was obviously when she vanished. Why do you think she went back to visit?
Well, she found something that she was good at. So she was doing floral arrangements at the Melbourne club, and then I believe she started a course. In fact, she did start a course. And she went back to the Melbourne club to, by all accounts, to speak to, I assume, the staff and potentially Vince. the capacity for there to have been a conversation between Vince and her about any ongoing relationship, if there was one, is likely to have certainly upset Vince if that was what was going on. Vince, having said that, was the last person to see her. So she went there, visited, and was never seen again. The last person known to be with her was Vince.
Do you think Vince potentially had motive to kill her, especially if that was perhaps an attempt to break off a relationship?
Breaking off a relationship's not an unusual motive, I have to say, in my experience. It's a very strong motive, particularly for someone who likes control. All of the incidents that I've been talking about, even with his children, I mean, they're all female. Obviously, the two missing people are female and the murdered Miller is female. So, those sort of things, whilst they go towards motive in itself is not enough to convict. And so you need facts. And the problem is that, as time goes by, the facts drift away and they're harder and harder to find. And so what you're left with now is trying to find the remains of these people if they are in fact murdered.
Do you know if Flora is still alive or if anyone spoke to her?
Flora is still alive, and as you'd imagine, she's very old. That in itself is problematic, both as far as memory goes, and also it's difficult as a police investigator to speak to someone at that age about something that is, well, if anything's happened that she knows about, would be quite traumatic for someone who was in their 90s. The unfortunate reality is that I think that there's a conversation that needs to take place with Flora. Obviously, it's got to be done in the right way. But realistically, there's three people that are, one that we know of is dead and the other two we assume are dead. So there's potentially three people murdered here. And I think, if you weigh it up, I think that the conversation has to take place, and certainly has to take place really quickly, because, someone who's in their 90s is not going to last very long.
The question, I suppose, becomes how did someone like Vince potentially get away with this if he was at the centre of these two disappearances and, one murder? Was it inadequate police work because it was so many years ago? Why do you think it was that no one until now really seems to have pulled all these threads together?
Well, there's probably a number of reasons here. I can tell you that if it were one of the, three of the members of the club, so if you're talking about people that are in the judiciary or politicians, I can guarantee you that there'd be enormous amount of resources put into it. Indeed, enormous amount of resources put into it now. But to be fair to the police, the problem is that they're very vulnerable people. New immigrants are always vulnerable, and they're particularly vulnerable when they first arrive because they don't have bank accounts. They're literally starting from scratch, and particularly when you're talking about into the 50s. So you've got these people that are probably the most vulnerable people, and it's not unusual for, and I'm not suggesting for a minute here that Vince is a serial killer, but I think when you look at serial killers in general, when their prey is people that are most vulnerable, that don't have a lot of family, that are on the streets or prostitutes or whatever, those murders often go unsolved because they're not reported to the police. So the police can only investigate when they realise that there is a crime. And so quite often these sorts of things go unnoticed. And then, as I say, it's very difficult to then go back and find the evidence that you need.
What are the chances that a case like this, where a woman vanished decades ago, might actually be solved?
I'd say it's quite easy if you can find the bodies. And, Flora's still alive. Flora was in the situation where she would hopefully be able to explain what happened, in the early days with Anna Maria. She would be able to explain any properties or land or houses that they owned. And it would be a matter for the police to then be able to go and search. And then, there's certain ways of doing that without excavating the whole lot. So technology has pushed forward. And so if you started finding bodies, then you get your answer. It's not really necessarily a massive investigation that the police need to do. It's obviously they need to speak to the surviving children and also Flora to see if they can start tying up a few of these loose ends.
I want to end on Matthieu, who his desire was to find his birth mother and father and discover who they were. Do you think he's found some peace in perhaps putting that puzzle together about what might have happened to his mother, even if justice hasn't necessarily been served? Was that your sense when speaking to him?
Oh, absolutely. And, despite the fact that he hasn't found the answer to Nenita's disappearance, all of a sudden he's got family, family everywhere, and he knows his history now. That in itself is something that is quite cathartic, I have no doubt. So he's kind of putting together, although it's an often bleak picture, he's actually putting together his family history. And I think that, that is something that's really good. The other aspect too is that he's realised that by chasing down a few of these rabbit holes, that he's actually doing the right thing by a huge amount of people. He's a lovely person. Once you meet him, you want to help him. He's on a search, and so I was more than happy to help as where I could.
Yeah, and I think he speaks for a lot of disenfranchised minorities who might not have a voice and who couldn't come over here and advocate on behalf of their loved one who had vanished. And so to have him have this platform is obviously a really important one, and to shine a light on the vulnerability of new immigrants to Australia as well, as you say, which is part of a larger story.
Oh, absolutely. And also it doesn't do any harm for the police force to be, have the champion that Matthieu is, for him to actually champion the cause of saying, these people are our most vulnerable and we should do everything that we possibly can to help when they come to grief, as it appears that we've seen here.
Thank you so much for your time, Simon.
I would be very disappointed and frustrated if the police doesn't consider again this case. So I hope that the work I've done will be the beginning for a new investigation. If my birth mother was here, she would be, I think, very happy that someone stand up and speak on her behalf.
You can find a link to the docu-series, Every Family Has a Secret, in the show notes of today's episode. Available on SBS On Demand, the series features investigations of 6 ordinary Australians with extraordinary secrets. Also in the show notes is a link to Simon's book, Filthy Rat, on police corruption and Melbourne's gangland war. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Our producer is Lem Zakharia. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.